The Seaview Railroad, a story of a South County railroad short-lived, but still held fondly in the memory of the few remaining with us, who rode it in those happy days long ago. Before beginning, I should like to mention, with thanks and appreciation, the several sources of my information, namely my acquaintance and conversations with the late Mr. William C. Clark, Jr., son of the road's founder and at one time superintendent of both the Seaview and Narragansett Pier Railroads. My talks with the late Mrs. Edna Treat, who carried in her memory a wealth of Narragansett history. Mr. G. Edward Prentice of Wakefield, whose father was an early and longtime employee of the road and at one time manager of the local night and power company. With Mr. Prentice's youthful memories of the line and many mementos which he has saved from his father's records, that source of South Kingstown and Narragansett history in the Narragansett Times, and my own experiences as a sometimes spare motorman during the summers of 1911 and 1912. Strangely, the Seaview Railroad had its start in Westley, Rhode Island, a locality which it had never reached. The electric streetcars came to downtown Westley in 1894. Somewhat connected with that operation was a Westley resident, Dr. H. L. Stillman, a civic-minded citizen who envisioned the trolley line not only in the town, but extending to the beaches and along the entire south and east shore of Rhode Island. The same year, he obtained a charter from the legislature for an electric railroad which would extend all the way from Providence to Westerly along the shore with the charter name of the Seaview Railroad. If Dr. Stillman's dream had come true, we perhaps would have had a real Seaview rather than the later line from East Greenwich to Narragansett, along which a passenger got very, very few glimpses of the sea. About this time, there was a businessman at Narragansett Pier, although a resident of Wakefield, an ardent civic leader and a man of extraordinary vision, as later events showed, by the name of William Case Clark. Mr. Clark, a descendant of two old-time Kingston families, was educated at the Kingston Academy and later Norwich University in Vermont. Returning to Kingston from his studies in 1863, he enlisted as a corporal in COK of the 9th Rhode Island Volunteers and served for the remainder of the war. After the war, he studied chemistry, and in 1867 entered into partnership in a drugstore with Mr. Silas Wright, under the firm name of the Wright and Clark. In 1868, they built the store on Main Street, Wakefield, and there conducted a thriving business for several years. In 1874, Mr. Clark married his partner's sister, Susan, one of the two daughters of the well-known Stephen Wright family of Wakefield. The firm was dissolved in 1881. Clark owned a Narragansett Pier where he established himself in the drug trade in a building on the site of the present Narragansett Post Office. Never a man to confine himself to one endeavor, Clark became interested in the coming lighting and transportation by electricity and was instrumental in forming the Narragansett Pier Electric Light and Power Company early in 1888. Electricity was supplied from a generating station near the former Narragansett Pier Railroad Station, now a laundry, and by 1889 most of the stores and streets in the pier and Wakefield were lighted by electricity. Although 16 CP lights of those days gave about as much light as a red-hot nail compared to what we have today, modern lighting was on its way. Incidentally, Mr. Clark's residence in Wakefield, remembered by many as the home of the late Dr. Burke and now a lumberyard location, was the first house in South Kingstown to be lighted by electricity early in the fall of 1888. Clark's interest now turned to transportation, and in the summer of 1896 he went to Nova Scotia where he took part in the building of a trolley line. Returning to Wakefield, he learned of the charter which had been obtained by Dr. Stillman and immediately moved to work with the doctor by getting the charter extended and putting the project through.
Soon after he got the Westley Charter, he had amended with the added provision that it provided the docking of steamboats from New York in Point Judith, with the idea of landing the passengers there and taking them to Providence or Boston over the Seaview,
thus avoiding a rough trip around the point and saving time as well. It also provided for docking of ocean liners near Bonnet Shores and getting the passengers into New York by rail, a thought which came up again only a few years ago, I think in the 1930s, when a transatlantic company applied for the same privilege. How Clark's vision worked out will later be seen and the varied fortunes of the Seaview. Now, however, Mr. Clark had the same problem as Dr. Stillman: insufficient money to carry out such a project. Several Wakefield businessmen became stockholders, but the necessary funds for an immediate start came from Mr. Andrew Radel, then owner of the Gladstone Hotel at the Narragansett Pier, who became enthusiastic about the Seaview possibilities. Mr. Radel at that time was well supplied with cash, having a business located in Bridgeport as the largest oyster grower and merchant in the U.S. He somewhat later on wished he had stayed with the oyster business and forgotten about the Seaview.
Financing was now assured, and things were ready to move. First, a tract of land was purchased from the Sprague Connecticut farm, which bordered the line of the Narragansett Pier Railroad, and which lay across the old right-of-way, which had been used by the horse car line running from Tower Hill to the beach in 1872. This was to be known as the Seaview Junction, and was on almost the exact location of the present Narragansett Pier Junior High School. As the Narragansett Pier Railroad never had an approach anywhere near the beach, the thought was to have passengers could come from Kingston, Peacetown, Wakefield, and leave the NPRR at the junction and to continue over Seaview to the beach.
This was also true for people coming from Newport or Providence. It all seemed like a good idea. Later on, there was a coal yard there run by Alfred Sanford, son-in-law of Nicholas Baker, the Wakefield coal dealer. The coal was brought in over the Seaview. This didn't last very long. Survey of the line started here late in March 1898. By May 4th, work on grading the roadbed, laying the track, and stringing the wires was well underway. A one-track trestle was built across the cove and mouth of Narrow River, almost 3/4 of a mile over swamp and water. By June 15th, the passable track had been completed from Seaview Junction to a station at the top of Ferry Hill in Saunderstown. New cars came on July 20th at 10:30 a.m. On Saturday morning, July 25th, 1898. 3 cars moved out the junction towards Saunderstown for a grand opening of the Seaview Railroad. In the first car was Wakefield Band, the 2 following filled with state and town officials, railroad executives and prominent guests. I was on that first trip going with my father, who was at that time treasurer of the Narragansett Pier Road and South Kingstown representative in the General Assembly. Ex-Governor Sprague was among the guests, and I remember being introduced to the tall, straight gentleman with a white beard by my father. Considerably underpowered for a 3-car train and driven carefully over the trestle and along the new track for more than an hour getting over the 6.5 miles to Saunderstown, but much faster coming back. A dinner at the Metatuxet Hotel in Narragansett for the guests ended that galley. Matt Clark, George Holgate, and Oscar Campbell, early Seaview motormen, were head-end men on the cars that day. Sometimes in retrospect, I think that at that glorious beginning, there appeared on the horizon a little cloud, as Miss Frances Kinney drove up in her little electric runabout to see the show. No one thought of it then, but it really heralded the coming of the auto, which in a short period of 20 years would make it not only the Seaview, but almost every trolley line in America obsolete and useless. The following morning, July 26, 1898, regular passenger service started on the Seaview Railroad. Work continued now in earnest on further extension of the line. The road from the junction to the beach over the old horse car roadbed was completed by August 6th. 3 days after the start of service, the wires were cut and the early morning car was stalled in the middle of the trestle. The passengers had to be taken off in a rowboat and landed on the shore. A disgruntled workman was apprehended and dealt with severely, that is, told to get out of town while the going was good and not to come back. Grading also started to the south. On September 5th, permission was granted to cross South Pier Road, Kinney Avenue, and Old Point Judith Road, and by late November, a graded roadbed had reached the salt pond at the Anthony Farm. Some of that roadbed can still be seen today. Whether or not this work to the south was done to encourage Westley people and keep them happy will never be known. From Saunderstown northward toward Wickford, where the junction went on, and although beset by trouble and suits for land damages from Narragansett and East Greenwich, the work continued. Although the Seaview discontinued service for the winter months, that first year by spring, things were looking up. On June 17th, cars began to run from Saunderstown to Wickford, and by the middle of August, service had reached the top of Letchery Hill in East Greenwich. The land damages, with few exceptions, have been settled by a commission appointed by the court. The section of the road from Narragansett to Saunderstown had a very successful season, but now came a setback for the Seaview. Although the original charter had given the road a right from Providence to Westerly, it was always felt by some that they should have started at the Providence end instead of Narragansett. In 1896, a group of financiers in Providence, led by Marsden J. Perry, who only a few years before had been running a little fruit stand on North Main Street, that's another fantastic story in Rhode Island history, had started a bank called the Union Trust Company, and 2 years later, by stock manipulation, had gotten control of the street railway system in the city, which they renamed the Union Street Railway. In February 1899, Senator Robinson of South Kingstown introduced and engineered through the legislature an act creating the Providence and East Greenwich Traction Company. This was a strange move on the part of our local senator, and one which gave the Union outfit a right to build a trolley line from Providence to East Greenwich over the main highway, which they promptly did. This precluded the chance of the Seaview ever reaching the city, except by negotiating with the Providence outfit, which they were obliged to do, of course, to their disadvantage. The rails met at a station at the top of Letchery Hill in East Greenwich, about where the Rhode Island Hospital Bank now stands. On September 15, 1900, in a grand celebration of the completion of a through trolley line from the pier to Providence, this time sponsored by the Union Railway people, cars with guests and the Wakefield Band left Narragansett at 3 o'clock. They changed into cars loaned by Manager Potter of the Union Line at Wickford and arrived in Providence at 5 o'clock p.m. After an elaborate dinner at the Narragansett Hotel, they arrived back in Narragansett Pier at 10:30 p.m. My father went, but I must have been a little too young to make this one. Soon after that date, a freight service was started over the Seaview, and although freight cars were allowed to go all the way into Providence, crews had to be changed at East Greenwich. Our passenger cars never did go through to Providence. Cruising cars always changed at East Greenwich until after the road was taken over by the Rhode Island 60 in 1911. Now getting back to Narragansett. Early in 1902, it became evident that things were not working out quite as foreseen at the junction. Passengers from Peacedale and Wakefield objected to changing cars for the short trip to the beach, and the freight service, which had been started in 1901 to Providence, found it would be unprofitable unless outlet could be made to Wakefield and Peacedale. Ways of getting the Seaview to those villages were now seriously considered, and finally an agreement for a 5-year lease over the line was entered into with the Narragansett Pier PRR to electrify the line to Peacedale and run both electric and steam. Work on this project was started on July 2, 1902, and on August 9th of that year, the first electric car went from Seaview Junction to Peacedale. Freight service was extended to the two villages on October 20th. An elaborate block system was installed with the dispatchers stations at both Peacedale and Narragansett, and although dire disaster was predicted by many older residents, no accident of any serious nature ever took place during the 5 years of operation. 1902 seems to have been a rather fateful year. Now the trestle over the long stretch of cove and river was beginning to give it trouble. It became a rather rough ride over it as the spiles sank up and down into the river bottom. In the fall of 1900, a high tide had actually completely covered the trestle with nearly a foot of water. In May 1902, permits were obtained to follow along the main highway from the covered bridge to the station on Beach Street, Narragansett. A new bridge was built about 50 yards west of the highway, and the tracks diverted to meet this new bridge and road. With this change, we now had a through trip without change from Peacedale to Providence. On October 10, 1902, Mr. Clark, who had been moving the spirit of the enterprise, passed away, still with an abiding faith in the ultimate success of the Seaview Railroad. As had been mentioned, the Seaview was badly underpowered from the very start, but now the road all the way to East Greenwich and the Narragansett Pier Railroad electrified. The situation called for an immediate change. In April 1903, a new power station was started at Hamilton and finished early that summer. which provided sufficient power for the trolleys. A 10,000-volt line to a substation at Seaview Junction to take care of the lighting and power for Narragansett, Wakefield, and Peacedale. Plans were made also to furnish electric service to the village of Wickford. This was, of course, a very necessary move, although I still remember that on that Sunday evenings before 1912, when the power began to come from Providence, Wakefield would suffer a blackout when two loaded trolley cars out of Narragansett would try to come over the hill back off the Maine's ice cream plant. One car would have to shut off and wait until the other made the hill. Then the lights in Wakefield and vicinity would gradually brighten up. But now, after the electrifying of Pier Road, the newly relocated road, new bridge at Narrow River, and new power station at Hamilton, Mr. Radel, sugar daddy of the Seaview, began to run out of money. The road had never been a financial success. Interest had been kept up on the bonds, but nothing was ever paid on the stock. In 1909, the Gladstone Hotel was sold at auction, and in 1910, Radel declared in bankruptcy. From that time on, the Seaview was on its own. In June 1907, the Narragansett Pier Road refused to renew the lease for joint use of the steam line. The agreement had not been proven to the benefit of the Narragansett Pier by any means. More people chose to ride to Narragansett and go directly to the beach for 10 cents on the Seaview than pay 25 cents on the train. And the trolley had taken major part of the local freight service to Wakefield and Peacedale, so the Seaview was forced to find another way of getting to the villages, which now was a must. They laid out a route over Tower Hill, following again somewhat along the route of the old horse car line, came over the hill back of Maine's ice cream establishment, and continued the tracks up to the center of Main Street, Wakefield, to a building on the site of the present Quick Tire Company shop, and established a freight and passenger station there. This was opened in the fall of 1907 and continued until the demise of the line in 1920. The following few years were perhaps the best and most prosperous in the annals of the Seaview. The automobile had not yet reached the point where it materially affected the railroads, and Narragansett Pier was still very active as a summer resort. It was during those years, summers of 1911 and 1912, that I have some personal memories. Cars were running on hourly schedules out of Wakefield. There was no more changing cars at the junction, and usual run to East Greenwich could be made in about an hour of running time. Of course, there were 14 stations on the Seaview line between Wakefield and East Greenwich, and on busy day stops at several of them could somewhat upset the schedule. It might be interesting to name the various stations along the route. Leaving Wakefield, it was Narragansett, Narrow River, Browning's, Anawan Farm, Art Club, now Bonnet Shores, South Ferry, Hazard's Quarry, Saunderstown, Plum Beach, Hamilton, Wickford, Camp Ave, Sam Hill, Hunts River, and at last East Greenwich. And during that run, we had to be mighty careful as the road crossed the main highway 7 times before Narragansett Pier in East Greenwich. I have rather vivid memories of coming into East Greenwich on Sunday mornings in the summertime with the 9:30 or 10:30 car from Wakefield. Our car stopped in front of the station at the top of Leachery Hill. Soon the opening car from Providence would roll in, crowded with people hanging off the running boards in every possible place where a person could be. Even before that car stopped full, about 50 feet away, they were off and making grand rush for the car going to the pier. I well remember how my car would rock on the track as people rushed on to fill the seats and to take up every available space on the long running boards on each side of the car. Those were hard days for conductors as they walked along the crowded running boards trying to collect the fares. Perhaps my somewhat aversion to snakes makes me remember big black ones that on hot summer days always came out of the swamp along Narrow River to sun themselves on the roadbed. There were always plenty of ordinary ones there, but I well remember the one day when a tremendous big fellow was lying across the track as I came along toward the pier. Our tracks were about 5 feet between the rails, and this fellow had a foot of head on one side and at least a foot of tail over the other side of the track. I stopped the car, and all passengers got out to watch him as he slowly crawled into the swamp. The last car was full out of Narragansett Pier, especially on Sunday nights. There was no place in SK then to entertain the thirsty, but plenty at the pier. Therefore, quite a few of our South Kingstown inhabitants found Narragansett the nearest place for a little elbow tipping. After an afternoon and evening in the beach street bars, the conductor often had to call me down from the front and to help them get on the car. And if good fresh air on the ride up to Wakefield didn't have a beneficial effect, we might have to deposit one of the times office steps or the freight station platform and feel they were well taken care of for the night. Although Jerry built and sometimes Jerry operated, the Seaview had very few serious accidents in all its years of operation. The most serious took place a short time after the road was opened between Saunderstown and Wickford near the Green Farm on August 6, 1899. Motorman Abbey was killed and the conductor seriously injured as two cars came together there. On Christmas Eve 1905, a Wakefield man was killed while walking the track below Tower Hill, and in 1918, Laura Samuel Allen of East Greenwich was struck by the Seaview freight at Camp Avenue crossing in North Kingstown. Mr. Allen was instantly killed and his car completely demolished. But on the whole, the Seaview had a very exceptional record of faultless operation. In the early summer of 1911, a big change came over the fortunes of the Seaview and Narragansett Railroad. The Grand Trunk Railroad of Canada, now the Canadian National, was expanding and anxious to get an ice-free port somewhere along the New England coast. They gained control of the central Vermont lines as far as Palmer, Massachusetts. Knowing of the Seaview Charter still in force with docking privileges in lower Narragansett Bay, they made an effort to get into Providence and purchase the Seaview and neighboring lines. The Grand Trunk Road was given a right-of-way and laid out and graded most of the way from Palmer to Providence. Construction was well underway over the route, and some of the roadbed and bridge abutments can still be seen along roads in the northern part of Rhode Island. But Charles W. Mellon, then president of New Haven, was determined to keep the Grand Trunk out of New England, and on June 1st, 1911, it was announced that the New Haven had taken a 99-year lease on the Narragansett Pier and Seaview Railroads. Also, the Providence and Danielson Road out of Providence to the west and would take over the operation. They also gained control of the lighting company and, of course, street railways in the city from the Union Trust, which had failed some time before. All this was reorganized into what would be known as the Rhode Island Company. There no longer was a Seaview. The Providence-Narragansett Division of Rhode Island Company cars from Wakefield then ran all the way to Providence. In 1912, the power station at Hamilton was abandoned and power for the railroad was furnished from Providence, and the high voltage line built from Providence to the present substation at Dale Carlia Corner. This line follows the old Seaview right-of-way, still owned by the Narragansett Electric, and if anyone wished to know where the Seaview Railroad ran, they would only have to follow this high line along the route to East Greenwich. All efforts of the Grand Trunk to get to Narragansett Bay ended with the loss of its President Hayes on the Titanic in 1913. Operations continued as before. Mr. William C. Clark, Jr. was made manager of both the Narragansett Pier and the Seaview, with Frank L. Caswell superintendent of the Seaview Division. Mr. Clark stayed in this capacity until the Narragansett Pier was taken over by the Government Railroad Administration during the First World War. Elaborate provisions for financing the lines were contained in the leases, calling for stock dividends and bond payments for the Seaview, but they were never fulfilled. As time went on, automobiles began to take its toll of freight and passenger service. It could be seen by the time of the First World War that the days of the Seaview and all other trolley roads were numbered. The Seaview Division had gone into receivership in 1918. The final blow came on August 2nd, 1920, when it was announced by the receivers that service would immediately be discontinued on the Seaview, and Danielson lines and all assets of the companies would be sold at auction on September 3rd. At the auction, Harry P. Cross purchased the 139,000 shares of the Seaview on which no interest had ever been paid, for $200. They had no value except as souvenirs, and if any of these certificates are still around, we would like to have one for the Historical Society. Nathaniel T. Bacon of Peacedale was the next owner of the Seaview and made very strenuous efforts to keep the line running, but the few days the road had been out of operation caused people who were still using its facilities to find other means. The farmers all along the route who had used it for getting their milk to Providence had been obliged to make a contract with Holly Trucking Co., then new in the field, and refused to go back with the railroad. Mr. Bacon asked the towns of South Kingstown, North Kingstown, and Narragansett to extend some aid, but it was unsuccessful. He tried by reducing running expenses to keep the road in operation by reducing crews, cutting schedules, and using one-man's cars, but to no avail. An attempt to resume the freight business ended in failure on November 1st, 1920. He announced that he had contracted with the Fairchild Co. of New York to junk the line. By January 1st, 1921, all poles, wire, and track from Wakefield to East Greenwich had been taken out. Only the ties on the stretch up Main Street, Wakefield, remained, which we know did for some time. And so ends the saga of Seaview Railroad, a short but eventful story.